Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Q&A part 3, September. So I got it. I did it. Why do you think Intel has not adopted AMD's 3D V-Cache or something similar to boost gaming performance on Intel CPUs? I don't think IPC improvements are enough to close the large gap 3D V-Cache brings to the table. I mean, if they're big IPC gains, they would be. But I'm glad you said, what do we think? Because that's what I'll be giving you as my my guesswork. But so 3D V-Cache, that's been made possible by the advancements at TSMC. So, you know, it's not something that AMD could have just done without, you know, the TSMC manufacturing process that enables that. And we know that TSMC is a bit ahead. Well, I don't know if a bit ahead is what you want to use, but they've made some advancements that Intel is yet to catch up to. So there's probably that is holding Intel back. But there's a difference in architecture. I'm sure, you know, Intel will be pursuing 3D stacked technology for future architectures. So it's not something that they won't ever do. But it's also not evident that it's something they absolutely need right now. Because we've done some L3 cache capacity testing with 14th gen and 13th gen, for example, and found that, which again, they're the same generation, by the way, we found that it doesn't make too much difference on Intel, not like what we see when you go from like 16 megabytes to 32 megabytes on AMD. That's a significant difference. And then going to the 3D V-Cache, that's another significant increase. So it seems that the Intel architectures aren't as sensitive to the L3 cache capacity. So at least at this point in time, it's not evident that chucking a big fat stacked L3 cache on there would lead to substantial performance improvements like what we see, what we often see with the Zen 3, Zen 4, and upcoming, probably, hopefully, Zen 5.
Yeah, and I think if it was able to give a significant performance gain, certainly something that Intel would be exploring. So I don't think they'd be just dismissing it entirely. They have experimented with 3D packaging of various different things before, so it's something that they can do. But obviously, TSMC was first to that specific type of 3D packaging. So, yeah, it means that AMD's going to have a head start. And I think if they were going to go with something like a V-Cache sort of thing, we'd probably see that in this sort of generation. Because if you think about the architecture that we've had for the previous 3 generations, that was sort of established with Alder Lake and then refined for the I don't even know if you could call 14th gen a refinement, but it was refined at least once into 13th gen. So, and that was around the time, like when 12th gen came out, that was sort of around the time that sort of we were getting the first and then second generation V-Cache technologies from AMD. So obviously it takes time. If they saw V-Cache as a thing, right, they saw the 5800X3D and they're like, we want to implement this in our CPUs. It's not something they can just do the very next generation. It takes a while to get to the stage where they can put that sort of technology in.
Yeah, and there are trade-offs as well to adding 3D V-Cache, such, you know, power and thermal limits. You know, we've seen a reduction in clock frequency, which is something that's key to Intel achieving the performance they have at great power consumption. But yeah, again, it's not evident that just sticking 3D V-Cache even on those CPUs would be a benefit, because A, do they even need the extra L3 cache or just cache in general? And then having to offset that with lower clocks and whatnot, whether that would...
That's right. So like if they... I guess, you know, the Intel CPUs are generally clocked a little higher in terms of frequency than AMD parts. So if they had to drop it more to the level that AMD has with their V-Cache parts, like 5 gigahertz-ish sort of low range there, or even lower, they could be sacrificing like 20% of the performance of that part, 15-20% of the performance.
They wouldn't necessarily... And you lose that across the board.
That's right. So like you lose the frequency, but then you might gain 20% back from the extra cache.
But only in some instances that require the extra cache. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. It's not an over the board enhancement. So.
That's right. And you're sort of then in a neutral position. Like you've made the CPU design more complicated to ultimately get to the same position that you're already in. And things like Intel generally having a better memory controller that accesses faster DDR5 memory and things like that, lower latency generally, means that they don't need to rely as much on having fast cache. And I think that's why the things that you were saying in some of your benchmarking has come out, like the cache, Intel CPUs don't rely on cache as much because the access to memory is superior to what we see on AMD CPUs, which benefit more from cache because the memory control isn't as strong. So there's always trade-offs with these sorts of designs. And like I said, I think Intel would go down this path if it made sense. So if we never see a Vcache design from Intel, I think it kind of answers itself. It's that design wasn't appropriate for the CPU architecture that they were going with. Maybe it will be at some point in the future. I'm sure cache will continue to increase over time as it always does. Just that specific design we may never see for Intel parts. So,
all right, somewhat of a random one here, but sure, we'll might as well go into this. Buy an RTX 4060 or RX 7600 for full HD gaming. So what, like 1080p? Is that what full HD means?
I think it does these days still.
It's like the marketing term for 1080p.
Well, HD used to be 720p, which doesn't seem very HD by modern standards, does it?
I guess it was when it came out, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, by modern standards, sure. Anyway, what was the question? So, RTX 4060 presumably at $300 US. Or RX 7600 at what, $270? I think that's what they still sell for.
Yeah, you might get both for like $10 cheaper. But the difference isn't that much.
So about a $30 US difference.
Yeah.
And then we'll just leave the 7600 XT out of it because that's meant to be what, $30 more than the RTX 4060.
Yeah, and I believe it still is about that.
Yeah, which is like, I think if the 7600 XT was $300, that would be my obvious go-to.
Yeah, yes, I would agree. I think the VRAM capacity is probably going to age the best out of all the features and capabilities of those cards. I don't think ray tracing on a 4060 will age overly well. And even today, you're probably only utilizing that feature in a couple of games, and then it'd be questionable, like,
I mean, yeah, my opinion,
how well it would.
Yeah, my opinion is probably a little bit harsher. I would say that ray tracing is entirely irrelevant on a 4060.
I guess it's like you kind of need it for games like Star Wars Outlaws a little bit.
Yeah, that's true.
But it depends, because I'd say you're probably not turning on like a path tracing in Alan Wake 2,
and you're lowering the preset right down to the point where it's like, well, the Radeon GPUs and GeForce GPUs scale as if ray tracing wasn't being implemented. So again, how relevant is the superior
That's true.
ray tracing? So,
like, let's be honest, I'm not hugely enamored with either of these models. I'm not like, say, rush out. Yeah, the $250 to $300 US market is great right now, so rush out and buy a card.
If that's your budget, though, what's the alternative?
That's true. There's, I mean, unless you go used, it's really no
good
alternative.
So DLSS definitely is better, in particular at 1080p.
Yeah, it's kind of a situation where ideally you don't want to be upscaling at 1080p because upscaling performs the worst in general across all technologies at 1080p and generally reduces the visual quality of the game compared to running it native. But if you were going to use upscaling, then DLSS is significantly better than FSR at 1080p. I think the gap is smaller the higher in resolution that you go. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of in a weird situation, right, where we try to recommend people not to use upscaling on a class of card like this, but then if you were going to use it, DLSS is way better. So it's like, if you weren't going to use it, it's kind of irrelevant, but if you are going to use it, one is significantly better than the other. So it's hard because then there's the price difference as well, right? Like
$30. It's not huge, but then $30 at that price point,
it's like a 10%.
It's not nothing either.
A little bit more than 10%. And the performance for rasterization between the two models is very similar.
They trade blows.
Yeah, and the VRAM capacity is 8 gigabytes for both cards. So you, again, probably would have liked to see a bit more there, but for entry-level mainstream sort of gaming.
I think for the Radeon GPU to be my go-to, like, yeah, I would always recommend an RX 7600. It's more $250, like $50 off. That's a substantial discount. And at that point, you can really discount the advantage of ray tracing. You can just be like, it's DLSS rather. You can acknowledge that it's superior, but it's not worth paying that kind of premium for.
Yeah, and I feel like if the 7600 XT was at the same price as the 4060, it is a little faster than the 7600, which puts it a little ahead of the 4060. So you kind of, maybe you could use a slightly different upscaling quality setting, for example, because it has a little more performance. So you could probably, if you're using balanced DLSS, for example, maybe you could use like quality FSR, which probably doesn't narrow it substantially, but changes the equation a little bit. And then the big thing is obviously the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is probably going to allow you to run some games at a higher visual level, especially with texture quality. So If that was the like again, this is like an AMD blunder, isn't it? Like that would have been a great battle.
If the RTX 4060 is going to remain the constant at $300,
Yeah.
in my opinion, the 7600 needs to be $20 cheaper. The 7600 $20 cheaper, so $250. You're looking at me like I'm saying something weird.
$50 cheaper compared to
$50 cheaper than the 4060.
yeah.
So $20 cheaper than it currently is. At the
Oh
MSRP.
right.
Yeah. So I
with you now.
probably worded that poorly.
Right.
Okay.
$20 cheaper than it is right now.
I'm glad you looked at me confused because maybe I worded that wrong and everyone else was confused. So $50 cheaper than the GeForce competitor, making it $20 cheaper than it currently is.
Mhm.
So $20 discount off the RX 7600. And then the 7600 XT would need to be the same price as the RTX 4060. So $30 off its MSRP, getting it down to $300 US.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And
So
you could adjust that depending on where the 4060 is currently priced. So if it's like a little cheaper than $300, then shuffle.
Then relative. So basically price parity, 7600 XT, RTX 4060. And $50 whatever percentage that ends up being. So that's what I think. That, to be clear, that is for me to recommend the Radeon GPUs and not consider the GeForce GPU.
Yeah, so I think right now it's probably a toss-up to leaning towards the 4060 at current pricing.
Yep.
I think it was interesting when I looked across the used GPU market how much people are paying attention to VRAM capacity at the moment. You see pretty consistently for used GPUs that the cards with more VRAM have a higher average selling price on the used market. So people are factoring this into their buying decisions at the moment, even in the lower ranges where you see cards like 3060 12GB tends to be a little more expensive than other models. The 6700 10GB, a little more than you would see for
there's never going to be a $50 difference between the 4060 Ti's, for example.
No.
There's just no way that's going to hold its value. The 8GB model, that's terrible.
Yeah, like if you bought a 2080 Ti, those I think sell for about $20 more than a 3070 at the moment. That gap has widened a little over time as the 11GB of VRAM becomes more relevant. So there was an opportunity there, but yeah, I mean, I guess, would you consider buying one of those cards right now? I think we're probably not going to see next-gen models for a little while in that price range, but who knows? Like if RDNA 4 mid-range launch or whatever shakes up things a bit.
But it's 8 to 16GB and it's currently a $60 US difference.
Mm-hmm.
And once upon a time, Nvidia said that $100 is what the difference has to be. You can't be cheap. And then they got it down to 50.
Sorry. And I mean, that was, not really true, was it?
Well, clearly not, because it happened only like a month later or something after they said it. But they managed to get the $50 gap between the two 4060 Ti models, which is slightly smaller than the gap you see at the entry level for AMD. So the gap to the 16GB model is $6 US. It's too much. So anyway, all right. How have we got to the stage where both Intel and AMD have majorly screwed up either their launchers or their processors or their entire CPU lineup? So how have we got here, Tim, to the point where I guess AMD and Intel are fumbling the bag?
Hiring the wrong managers. No, it's CPUs. Well, it's actually probably true, but CPUs are difficult to make.
It's two very different circumstances, right? For one, so Intel's 13th to 14th gen. I mean, it was a refresh. I don't think the handling of the refresh was particularly bad. It was just a disappointing, like, oh, okay, cool, it's much the same.
Sure, kind of pointless, yeah.
So that was kind of a pointless thing to begin with. But then further down the track, we found out that the quality control and they were pushing things too close to the edge, which resulted in stability, degradation, all that kind of stuff. So that was obviously, that was really the Intel fumble, right? The Intel screw up. So,
and the handling of it.
And then the handling of it that came after, which we're still sort of making our way through. So we're not sure what the conclusion of that one is. So that's probably, I think it's fair to say, the greatest screw-up disaster we've seen in CPU manufacturing history that I can think of.
Yeah.
Certainly in recent times.
Yeah, there's been microcode bugs over the years for certain processes that I've had to redo, but certainly not good. I'm trying to think of, has there been anything else? I mean, you've been covering CPUs for longer than I have, so I don't exactly remember the really early days of things. But I think from a hardware issue perspective, it's the biggest that I can remember from any component. GPUs, I don't think there's been something like that either.
So that sort
really
of talks to the gravity of the situation, how unusual
Yeah.
it is to have the biggest blunder of blunders. So that's the Intel side of things. AMD side of things, really, again, the Zen 5 one's tricky because, as we've said time and time again, it's not that Zen 5's bad. It's not that it's not that it doesn't work. Like it's perfectly fine in that sense. It's like a Zen Plus type moment. It's a very, for desktop users, for gaming, it's a very, 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 very small step forward. In some instances, a bit of a step backwards, but overall, very small step forward because it wasn't designed and optimized with those use cases in mind. They were going after AI workloads, development software, all that sort of stuff that we've talked about before, server stuff, all of that, that's where it shines and does well. So in that sense, if that's what it's targeted at, and they want to use this architecture mostly to sell epic CPUs, and that's where they'll make all their money, then it's like, okay, fine. The blunder there was the marketing, right? It was never going to be an exciting, no matter which way you slice it, Zen 5 was never going to be exciting for us.
Yeah.
But with the right expectations and knowing that this was going to be more of an incremental upgrade, a small step forward, if we knew that from the outset, it'd be like, oh, okay, that's a bit disappointing, but okay. And I think that would have changed the tone of the reviews. It would have changed the tone of the reception from the public, what you see on all the community forums and all that sort of stuff. People would have sort of known, it wouldn't have been unexpected. It would be like, okay, well, this is pretty much what AMD said it was. So, it's, as pricing filters down, it'll still be a valid option for me potentially. And, there's the X3D chips to come. So I think that would have landed differently and we wouldn't have seen anywhere near the degree of drama we've sort of seen around it. So
yeah, I think the root cause of both of those scenarios, it goes back to competition and CPUs being hard to make. Because you look at sort of like what Zen 5 did achieve, which is new architecture, as you said, benefit for server workloads. Now, I'm sure they would have loved to have made it also much better for gaming and desktop workloads by maybe changing out the I/O die or using a more advanced process node or something along those lines. But CPUs are hard to make. They can't do all of those things at once at the moment in one generation. They had to focus on, well, at least what it appears to be, a certain number of things, which was improving IPC, adding AVX 512, better AVX 512 support, those sorts of things. They couldn't do it all at once. And Intel, they were sort of chasing AMD in some way with their CPUs. So as they pushed further and further up in terms of frequency and power, they've run more and more into the issues that we've seen in terms of stability and things. And I don't think the Intel situation would be happening if competition wasn't as strong as it was. They just would not have pushed as hard. They would have made their CPUs a little less good and made them a little more efficient because there wouldn't have been the competition to encourage the parts that we did end up getting. They were chasing the fastest gaming CPU and they nearly got there. In many ways, their CPUs are still quite competitive in terms of performance. And then, on the AMD side, the marketing side of things goes back to competition as well. They're not only competing with Intel, they're competing with their own parts. So they have to try and present these CPUs in a way that gets people interested in buying them. If Zen 4 wasn't a good generation and no one was interested in buying it, then they could probably get away with just saying Zen 5 is a little better and, hopefully you'll buy it. But people were flocking out to buy those CPUs. They had to give people some reason to buy a Zen 5 CPU, which means they have to get a bit more creative with the marketing.
It's frustrating though because it was never really going to work, was it? Like,
no, it wasn't going to work.
What you're saying is like Intel was forced into a mistake. They had to compete.
I think it's a similar sort of mistake. I think both of them were management errors. They didn't have to make an unstable CPU. They could have just made it stable, but it wouldn't have been as good.
I'd love to see a reality play out where they were just honest about what they were achieving with Zen 5 and what it was going to mean for desktop users, and let that play out the generation, let it land with what I think with reasonable expectations, I think the reviews would have been more positive in general.
Mhm.
And then I think as the pricing filtered down, it would have just carried on with the
I think
AM5s.
so.
I think that's how it would have played out. But
I think as well, potentially if Intel didn't push as hard on the power and crazy, all that craziness, because that really did dominate discussion around like 13th and 14th gen parts, was how power hungry
that
and
was
hot they were.
yeah, they wanted to maintain that mind share though that like Nvidia has of being the
I think they did,
flagship
but
brand.
again, it would have been interesting to see an alternate reality where they didn't do that. They made the parts a bit more reasonable, and sort of see what would the reaction have been like in terms of sales and consumer reception. I think in both instances, in hindsight, I think they were both errors. But again, it's really hard to say. I think the Intel side is probably a little harder to say. I'm pretty sure that AMD could have marketed Zen 5 better. I don't know whether Intel not producing a Halo part or making it as good for gaming, for example, would have been better.
I think getting dominated
it's
by
hard.
the X3D parts would have been pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's hard.
Because if they were more in line with the Zen 4 non-X3D parts, and then X3D was just out there on its own,
it's
I
tricky.
think that's a problem. But again, it's caused by competition, so as you say.
But yeah, I think it's competition, CPUs being hard to make. We're in the diminishing return sort of generations now where it's hard to eke out performance gains. And then, just those two things causing interesting management decisions. And ultimately, it is the responsibility of management who makes those sorts of decisions. And I'd like to think that some of those people would want their time again to maybe go down a slightly different path, but we'll see. There's opportunities with upcoming products, especially from Intel, to make some different decisions. So we'll see what happens.
Do we need Intel's Arrow Lake architecture to be more efficient to become competitive with Ryzen, or do they need more of an uplift in performance from last generation to be competitive? I would say it needs to be significantly more power efficient.
Yes.
For one, that absolutely needs to happen. And really, that does need to be a bit more performant as well. We need a little bit of extra performance there. And I think that's just because of how much of a disaster 13th and 14th generation has been in terms of the initial sales. Like, they haven't been a great success in terms of sales. And then the whole Intel stability concerns, which still pretty much an ongoing issue, right? We don't really know where everything stands there. Has the problem been addressed? If it has been addressed and now it's fixed with these new BIOS microcode updates, what happens to all the CPUs that did degrade? How's Intel, addressing that, looking after those existing customers? So with all of that noise and disaster in the background, and they need to make substantial strides with Arrow Lake.
Yeah, I think the way I'd look at it is, right, if you're considering, let's say, for example, that Arrow Lake was the exact same performance that we've currently got, but is much more efficient. So that's kind of the first half of the hypothetical, right? I think if you were buying an Intel CPU, that you would clearly buy that over a previous gen model. You would definitely consider Arrow Lake. So then the question would be, would that be enough to make you consider it over an AMD product? And so they're reasonably competitive with the 14900K in performance today. Like, they're not completely out of the running compared to Zen 5 with a 14900K, but the reason most people wouldn't buy one are things like platform considerations, the power consumption, the stability issues. So I don't think a product that maintains level of performance but gets much more efficient would be completely dead in the water. It just wouldn't be that amazing. It'd be like, yeah, you might consider the Intel part, you might consider the AMD part. They're pretty similar. It's all good. There's been an improvement compared to the previous generation. I think if we were talking about needing it to be an obvious choice, like not recommending an AMD processor or Zen 5 or Zen 4 or whatever, I think you're on the money with it needing to also offer a little more performance, whether that's 5 or 10% more performance. They're not hugely behind, but if they could have claims on, say, around the mark of the fastest gaming processor, not necessarily the fastest outright, but like about a 9800 X3D or whatever it turns out to be in performance. If they can get to that level while improving efficiency, it doesn't even have to be as efficient as a Zen processor, I don't think that would be completely discounted. from people's buying decisions,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're largely targeting people that haven't upgraded to AM5, and there's sort of the platform considerations, which platform is going to give more longevity.
It's a big ask though, because we're essentially saying that's the starting point.
That is, yeah, and when it comes to efficiency, it can't be a little better. It has to be
miles better.
It has to be removing that discussion point from this when we're talking about CPU reviews and things, where efficiency is about ballpark between both. So therefore, it's not really a talking point. You just get whatever. It's difficult because it's unclear whether they can do both of those same things in the one generation. Potentially, if they went really hard on efficiency, they'd be losing a bit of performance. But then if they are targeting performance, you'd lose the efficiency window that the parts are designed for. So, yeah, it's not really clear what's going to happen there. But I think the best case scenario is probably more in the line of improving efficiency while keeping performance about the
Similar,
same.
yeah, I think that's likely.
Yeah, because
yeah.
Well, I mean, rumors are suggesting that there is an IPC increase with Arrow Lake.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is also a clock speed regression.
Mm-hmm.
So how those things balance out, you may see performance around the same mark or only slightly better.
Yep.
So we'll see how that all plays out because it's not far away. So we'll be getting some answers on that pretty soon, and it's a big opportunity for Intel. Zen 5 kind of was disappointing. They can put the stability stuff behind them, so there's certainly plenty of chances for Arrow Lake to succeed. So we'll see.
I sometimes see better prices for RAM kits with 4 DIMMs of lower capacity than kits with 2 DIMMs of higher capacity. I imagine they're the same overall capacity though, at the same speed and latency. Considering the lower maximum RAM frequency in a 4 DIMM configuration, do you think this trade-off can be worth it? I guess it depends on the price difference that we're actually talking about here. I imagine it's not great in most instances. So I would always be recommending get the dual DIMM kit rather than the quad DIMM kit. For reasons that you noted, obviously it's easier to achieve the advertised frequency of the memory modules when there's only 2 of them. And it does leave room to compromise on frequency for capacity down the track if capacity becomes a greater concern than frequency, for example. But yeah, 2 sticks, simpler, less likely to run into issues, and would be certainly worth a small price premium.
Yeah, I think 4 DIMMs only really makes sense if you need capacity beyond what a 2-stick configuration can offer. So if you're really targeting like the 128 gigabytes and above sort of thing, that's where you'd go for that. And usually in those situations, the trade-off generally makes sense because you need the capacity for some application, and the frequency and latency aren't relevant too much. Like for gaming, you don't need 128 gig of RAM, so it's not that relevant for that sort of use case. So, yeah. With Intel's seemingly non-stop barrage of problems recently, do you think Arc is in danger of being cut? If so, it'd be reasonable to assume drivers would stop being developed. Maybe. It depends on the iGPU situation. Should that be a factor for any prospective buyers of Battlemage? I mean, obviously they're making substantial cuts to their workforce at the moment. I think they're cutting, 15,000 employees, which is a lot. I personally think it would be a pretty short-sighted move to cut the graphics division. I'm not saying this is not something an executive would do, because an executive would definitely cut something for executives love cutting stuff for short-term gains and having no foresight into the future whatsoever. That is their bread and butter. They love doing that. So there is every chance that it will be cut based on that basis of it not delivering short-term gains. I think that would be pretty silly. I think Arc has a genuine chance to be competitive. Maybe not competitive in the high end anytime soon, but it's possible for an Arc product to be a good buy. They're not, I wouldn't say they're hugely far off. There's obviously driver concerns and things like that, but I think it's maybe a couple of generations before you'd say the product is in a really good position. They're certainly heading in the right direction. So I think cutting it would be really dumb. That doesn't mean it won't happen though, and I think it's certainly a risk. So if you're buying a Battlemage card, that's, Intel's going to have to, I guess, reassure buyers when they release that generation that we're sticking around, we're not in any threat of being...
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of a concern it really is for potential buyers. You would be buying that product you're sort of taking a plunge, a
Yeah,
leap
you
of faith
are.
on that
Yeah.
product, and you'd be doing so because it's really compelling in terms of price to performance. Which I don't think for the most part, I don't think the current generation, the A770, the A750, I don't think they were.
No, they weren't.
I think the RX 6600, for example, was pretty much always a better choice. It was a safer choice, and it was a better choice. So if you bought an Intel Arc GPU, you were doing it because you kind of wanted to be part of the experiment. Whereas with the next generation, if you're hopping on for reasons beyond just wanting to be part of the experiment, you're doing so because they've proven to be great in terms of price to performance.
Mm-hmm.
And as for the future of Arc, probably not as concerned about that. You just want to get a graphics card that's delivering great performance for the money in the games that you're playing right now.
Mm. Yeah, and we've seen even with AMD GPUs that they tend to cut driver support for some of the more popular older cards sooner than expected. We certainly saw that with some GPUs in the last couple of years where they probably cut support a little too soon for some products. So yeah, you're not in the clear 100% when you buy Radeon cards, especially because often the entry-level cards come later in the generation, which means by the time they cut that family, it's less time than buying the high-end cards. But yeah, I think generally people should be buying Intel GPUs based on what they can do now, not so much, what's the threat of them deleting the driver division? I think it's to me at least, I think it's unlikely that the driver division and stuff would be just completely decimated, and that's because they're still going to be producing mobile CPUs with some sort of graphics in them.
Mm-hmm.
So even if like the desktop GPU division is just completely muted, they're still going to have to design graphics for their CPU and laptop mobile products and things. So the driver team will always be working on stuff for that. I guess the question is, will those things apply to like a Battlemage GPU that you've bought well into the future? It's hard to say, but I don't think the driver team will just completely disappear. So yeah, I think they have an opportunity with Battlemage to improve some of those things, improve the price to performance ratio. And I think it could be compelling, and I wouldn't be worrying too much about those sort of things. I think if they were going to not have a GPU division, that they would just cancel Battlemage. I think they just wouldn't bother releasing it. They'd probably have a pretty good idea at this point where the reductions that they've said are going to come from. So if you're going to say we're cutting 15,000 employees, you probably have an idea of where you're going to target like those reductions from. And I imagine they have a pretty good idea internally. So if they were going to cut the GPU division, probably just don't bother releasing that product. But I think they're still, by the sounds of it, going to go ahead. It's hard to say, but we'll see.
Yep. How old can games be to still be relevant for general buying advice? What about for benchmarking modern hardware? I mean, like games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider are still pretty good for, what was that, 2016, I want to say? Something like that?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Pretty old. Well, that's very old, really, and it's still one of the, well, up until recently.
It could have been 2018, not sure.
That's true.
There was another Tomb Raider in 2016, was there?
Pause.
12 seconds later.
All right, we've got back. Tim was right. It's 2018. What was I thinking? 2016. Crazy. Absolutely ludicrous. In hindsight, I can say that. But that's quite an old game at this point in time, and that's still a pretty good game for testing CPU performance if tested in the right area. Of course, the village section that we use, very good. But how old can the games be? Well, it depends on how well they utilize current hardware. If a game is utilizing current hardware well, then it's still a pretty relevant or useful game for testing. I mean, there are games like Ashes of the Singularity, which still very heavily utilize modern CPUs very well, but no one really uses it anymore because no one really ever played Ashes of the Singularity. No shade thrown at that game. That's just the reality of the situation. So while you could still use that game to really stress test modern hardware, and it would be, I don't know, an okay game to do so, AMD like to use it still, with no one having really ever played it, and there's not that much point. So, but again, I wouldn't say that you shouldn't or couldn't use that game. It's just more people played Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So, and we don't use Shadow of the Tomb Raider anymore, really. We might feature it in a big benchmark video, but for day one reviews, we don't use it. We try to stick to games like Starfield and Forbidden West and those sort of games, the more more recently released titles.
Yeah, I think when it comes to single-player games, it's obviously the more recent titles are generally more relevant because games from many years ago, people have played that and moved on. That's just the life cycle of single-player titles, with some exceptions. There are games that, of course, like, I guess GTA 5 kind of has a multiplayer component, but it has a long lifespan, those sort of games. But I think if you're not going to test the very latest titles and you are picking games from a while ago, it does make sense to include them as sort of a through line from many different years that you can sort of look at and say, well, we were testing that game 5 or 6 years ago, so how has performance improved? How can we do comparisons that go as far back as 2018 for those sorts of games? It's very unlikely that you'd have a lot of good historical data for Baldur's Gate 3 because the game just wasn't out 6 years ago, but you might have some interesting things to say about how performance has gone in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example. So if you're using those, if you're going to decide upon a game you're going to use for a long period of time, it's really good to use something that was fairly modern when it came out. We did use modern hardware as best as it could at that time. So obviously if we chose a game from 2018 that was very heavily single-threaded, and most games today aren't really like that, then it probably would have been a bad choice to use that for 6 years worth of benchmarking because it wouldn't have been that representative. But I feel like games like Cyberpunk 2077 is probably going to be used for a long time for reasons like that. You know, it was very heavy when it came out for both GPU and CPU testing. It's still, people are playing it today, so it is relevant in some way still for today. And yeah, it will be interesting to see performance comparisons for a while using that sort of game.
Yeah, and I'm sure some people will make the argument, you know, you should test with GTA or some older game like StarCraft, for example, because it's really CPU demanding in the sense that it utilizes very few CPU resources, a couple of cores, so therefore it becomes CPU limited. But that's a good, you know, it represents those games well. And that's true. That's a reasonable argument to be had. But at the same time, modern latest and greatest CPUs should play those games as well, if not better than the CPUs years ago that were playing them well, if you know what I mean. So again, you really want to push the envelope with the new demanding stuff that's utilizing like 80% of a 7800X 3D, for example, because
I guess you're kind of saying like if we were all okay with StarCraft 2 performance when it came out,
or certainly years after it came out.
In the years after it came out, you're like, this game runs pretty well.
Yeah.
Then it's probably less relevant than a game like Starfield, which there are sections of that game which are very CPU demanding in a way that does reduce the experience in that game. Because especially if you're using like a Ryzen 3000 or 5000 part, you could be getting a sub 60 FPS experience in some parts of the game, CPU limited. So yeah, I think your approach of taking largely modern games for single player titles makes a lot of sense. Sprinkling in a few of the popular multiplayer games that have quite long lifespans, things like Counter-Strike and those sorts of games, Fortnite. I guess those games do get updated a fair bit to keep them relevant. But,
yeah, Fortnite in particular.
The base engine there is usually pretty similar. But I guess the point is that choosing games, you need to have some sort of reason behind it. And so if you're going to choose old games, you should have some sort of reason why you're doing that. And there's many different ways that you can make that sort of argument, but generally sticking to modern games is probably going to give you the best overall look at processors, graphics, now and into the future. So,
all right, Tim, I'm relieved. Another successful Q&A series. We smashed it out of the park on that one. Everyone's going to love it.
Nice. Were you nervous going in?
I was a little bit, yeah. But now, all of that just seems silly because of how well we did.
Nice.
And everyone will agree.
Well, I certainly hope so. It's not always the case. Sometimes I read the comments and you have to go cry in the shower a little bit, but most of the time it's pretty good.
So where do you cry? I mean, I don't know what I expected. So yeah, don't make Tim cry in the shower, I guess. Be kind in the comments below. Hopefully you did enjoy this month's Q&A series. If not, I don't know what to tell you. We're definitely doing it again next month.
We'll be back again for some more disappointing content that no one likes.
Make sure you subscribe for that. You're not going to want to miss it. Yep, we have YouTube members, Patreon, all that good stuff's there. So check that out if you're interested. And if not, you know what? Tim will probably hold it against you. I won't because, you know, I'm not that way inclined. But Tim will cry about it in the shower. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.